Hi, everyone. I'm sorry, I'm actually a minute late today. We'll get started in just a minute. Thank you all for being here. All right, can everybody see the screen and can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. So today's intro question, as always, what do you like to be called and where in the world are you from? And today's question is, do you have any favorite stories? So it could be a book or movie, some kind of family story or fairy tales or folklore, or maybe a story from your culture. And if you'd like, you can type that in the chat or you can say them out loud. Someone in the chat mentioned his Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. That's a good one. I like that one too. Breeding Sweetgrass. So yeah, we all hear stories, we all interact with stories in our lives. And so today, the writing workshop will focus on what is a story? And if you're new, welcome, and I'm Rebecca. So we all have favorite stories, and what is it about them that makes them our favorite? What makes them compelling to us? Any thoughts from anyone?
The story is just something, I mean, what makes them compelling? They're interesting. They are something that you wish you could do or be or have. It's a way you can kind of go into imagination, view the world in different ways.
Thanks, Jane. Any other thoughts?
I think
a story that has a surprising twist at the end is quite compelling.
Alexandra?
I feel like I come at it from two very different places. I love stories that resonate and connect very directly to something within my life, whether past or present. But I also love stories that take me to another life experience that I never have had or I'm never likely to have. And it's almost like in your imagination, you're living that experience through the story that you might not have had in your own life. So I quite enjoy both.
Yeah, that's a good point. They can relate to our lives, or they can bring us to something new. So last time, our topic was journaling and nature, our outer and inner landscapes. So Shanna Lee, who I see is here again today, presented about journaling as a way to process our experiences and our emotions, and more of normal journaling. And then we can add nature to that to learn lessons about life from our surroundings. And again, today is what is a story, as we've already started to discuss. So there's this program I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. It's called Story a Day. I'm not affiliated with it or anything, but it's they have a story prompt every single day in May, and that's more of creative writing, not really to do with nature journaling, but it's a fun activity, and it inspired me to do today's workshop about stories and how we can connect stories to nature journaling. Just to get it out of the way, this is a free workshop for the Nature Journal community, but if you are able to donate any amount, it's greatly appreciated and helps me to keep putting these on. So when we talk about nature stories, what does that really mean? If we break it down, what is nature, first of all? I think there might be a whole other workshop about that in the future, but also what is a story? And if you've read the description of this workshop, either on the events, on the Nature Journal Facebook group, or on John Muir Law's website, I started the description with this quote from the book How to Teach Nature Journaling by John Muir Laws and Emily Ligern. And the quote is, "Stories are everywhere if you know how to look." But again, how do we know how to look, and where exactly are these stories that we can find in nature or anywhere around us? So I'd like to actually begin today with some short writing time. So I'd like to invite you to write about some kind of experience that you've had in nature or something that you've observed. It could be recent, but it doesn't have to be. So right now, our goal is just to capture as much information about the event as we can. Just get as many details and as much information on the paper. Kind of like if you were a reporter and you had to figure out everything about this, or maybe like if you were a scientist, just trying to get the information, not necessarily as a story. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, I'm going to put on a timer for 5 minutes. I would say 10, but I want to make sure that we have time for everything else. All right, ready, set, go. And let me know if you have any questions. Oh, one more thing about this part, you don't have to use full sentences right now. You can just use words or sentence fragments, bullet points if you want to. It doesn't have to be fully formed anything right now. Okay, that was 5 minutes already. How is it going for everyone? All right, I would like to give us 10 minutes, but we're going to have a little bit more writing later and then time to share. So I just want to make sure that we get through everything. Okay, so we can either write like a scientist and have a list of observations or a list of facts. A couple weeks in April, we did poetry, so we practiced writing like a poet. You might have some kind of poetic, flowy description that's really beautiful, or not that all poems have to be beautiful in that way, but I think you get what I'm trying to say. So these are both different ways that we can write, but either way, it's not automatically a story. So what makes it a story as opposed to just a list of facts or just a nice description? And what makes a story more fun to listen to than either one of those things? And how can we use story to share what we are learning as a scientist? When we use our nature journal to explore and learn more about the world around us, how do we share that with other people? is, have you ever had this experience where you're out in nature and you find something that you think is really, really cool and exciting, and then you come back and try to explain it to someone, and you're like, oh, I saw this thing. And they're just kind of like, okay, cool. So what? And maybe sometimes it's just the other person. Maybe they're just not interested in it. But I've at least noticed for myself, sometimes if I just say what the thing is, or just give the plain observations, it doesn't really always convey that excitement and that discovery. So how can we share what we learn in a way that's interesting to other people? And so what are the elements of a story that make it a story? Any thoughts from anyone? Lana?
Well, you have to have events, at least a couple, one minimum event. You have to have a character doing the event and setting, but that's kind of a given with nature, I guess. Yeah, so I think those are the absolute essential elements of a story.
Yeah, those are a few of them. Stephanie?
Conflict. Story has to have conflict, a protagonist, an antagonist, and some kind of conflict that's resolved, a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah, that's a big one. Anyone else? All right, well, you just mentioned a bunch of them. So there are some core elements of the story. Now, when I was preparing for this presentation, I was like, elements of a story on the internet, and there's a whole bunch of different things. Some people are like, oh, these are the 5 elements you need a story. These are the 7, or these are the 8. So there are a lot of things that could be included in this, but these are a few of the most important ones. And I feel like, I don't know about you guys, I think I learned all this in probably 3rd grade, learning about stories, but I think it's important to revisit it once in a while in an intentional way. And right now we can talk specifically about how this might be able to apply to our nature journaling. So character, setting, conflict, plot, or events, and another one is theme. So character is, who is the story about? And importantly, what do they want? So if you have, a situation and a type of character, that's a premise. But if they want something that they're trying to achieve, now that's a story. So when we're nature writing, who are the characters in our stories? That might be, and again, everything that I'm saying in this section about how this applies to nature journaling, these aren't any kind of literary rules or anything. These are just kind of my thoughts. And you're free to add on to this, agree or disagree, or add your own interpretations. So when we're nature writing, who's the character of our story? That could be you going out and exploring and interacting with the world. It could be the other people that you're with, if you're with anyone. It could be the creature, the plant or animal or whatever that you're observing might be the character. Maybe it could be the land itself, if you want to write from that perspective. So there are a lot of options. And that might, but thinking about it and just realizing that we have an option of who the character is might help us to focus, figure out what is the story about. And then setting, as you mentioned, yeah, it's kind of obvious with nature journaling, but not necessarily. I don't think that it should be overlooked, because that is a really key part of any story to do with nature, is where does it take place? What kind of ecosystem or environment is it in? And that really affects the whole thing, because the type of biodiversity that's in a place depends on the ecosystem it is, like what characters or what creatures are even there to begin with. What kind of resources are in the environment that is helping the character or maybe the creature to get what they want. Because nature stories can happen in all different kinds of settings. There's kind of the stereotypical, pastoral, countryside or the wilderness kind of nature stories, but there's also urban nature stories and suburban nature stories and all different kinds of things. So being aware of the place that we're in and how that sets the stage for the story, I think is really important, because with nature stories, maybe there are some kinds of stories where you could kind of just transplant the characters or the conflict into some other setting. And, I think writers like to be creative with this a lot. There's like Shakespeare, but in modern time, and all different kinds of things. And I think with nature stories, that's a little bit harder to do because the story is so dependent on place, although we can always be creative too. And just to clarify, when I'm talking about story here, I'm talking more about like how we can show our experience in nature, which is based in fact and based in science, in how we can tell it as a story. But there's definitely a lot of possibility for being more creative and writing fictional creative stories based on our experiences with nature too. But the elements of story can help us either way. And conflict. Basically, the main character wants something, and what is it they want, and why do they want it, and most importantly, what's getting in their way of getting whatever it is that they want. Because if the character could just get what they want right away with no trouble, that wouldn't be a very interesting story. And so there are a lot of different conflicts that we might have in nature stories. So if it's the story of us and our exploration, the conflict might be this scientific puzzle, this mystery that we're trying to solve, and how do we go about solving it? That's a story. If we're using nature journaling as more of a personal journal of our inner landscape, as we talked about last week, the conflict might be some kind of inner struggle that we're dealing with. And, we go out into nature to try to work through this and try to resolve, what's inside of us. If we're observing some kind of creature, like a plant or an animal, maybe as like a bird is trying to build a nest, or some animal is trying to escape a predator, or all the other behaviors that we observe. Of course, we can't tell for sure what an animal wants. We don't want to anthropomorphize them, but we can tell by their behavior that they're doing certain things, and that could be a story. And then also in nature and in the environment, there are a lot of problems for facing the environment. So it could be, the conflict could be something like pollution or some other environmental problem that's happening in your area. And then the plot is what happens, the events of the story. So the character wants something, but they have a conflict that's in their way. So how do they face that conflict? What do they do? And how does each event lead into the next? Because the events don't just happen randomly. It's because this event happens, and then because of this, the next thing happens. It's all cause and effect. So in nature writing, maybe some of the plot could be, what's the process that we go through if we're trying to solve a scientific mystery? If we're exploring a place, what's our movement from within that place, what are the different places that we see or the different things that we observe, or that might be the actions of the creature that we're observing, or it could be a lot of other things. Again, these are just some of my thoughts. And the last one is the theme. So this is the underlying message, kind of the moral of the story. It could be obvious or it might be subtle. And you might start writing with a theme in mind, but don't force it. That might kind of reveal what the theme is as you go along. And if we're writing more of like scientifically, or just getting our observations, if our goal is to get accurate information recorded, they might not necessarily be a theme, but if we're writing our stories, a theme might come up. So it's kind of like the surface level is the events, the characters, the places, but then the theme is like, what is the story really about? So that's kind of the question that comes into my mind often when I see a movie trailer that just come out, like especially every time I see a trailer for a new Pixar movie, and it's like, okay, here's like the fun, the characters or the setting that's this movie is going to be about. But I'm always wondering, okay, but what is this movie really about? Like, what's the moment that everybody's gonna cry over? Because like, what is it that makes the story really meaningful? That's what I think about. So in nature writing or in nature stories, the theme could be all kinds of different things. I'm not really going to give any specific examples. There are definitely some sorts of stereotypical examples in nature writing, but it really is as varied as the people writing it, because we all have different perspectives, we all have different life experiences, and this is really where our unique perspective has a chance to shine and to come out. Because we might observe the exact same event and have a different perspective or a different idea of why it matters to us. What kind of meaning we create from it is something that's unique to all of us. And that's part of why, when we talk about with nature journaling, it's not just a pretty picture. With words, it's not just about having pretty writing. It doesn't really matter what anybody else is doing, because we all have a unique voice, and we all can do it differently. So those are some of the main elements of a story. There's also, we can look at story structure. I'm kind of a nerd about this. I really love thinking about story structure, like if I'm going to read a book or watch a movie. And there are a lot of different story structures that you can use. This is a really common one. And basically, it's the idea that every story, or not every story, but at least a lot of stories in the world are basically all the same story, but with different with different setting, different characters. As Joseph Campbell is pretty famous for writing the book Hero with a Thousand Faces, which looked at myths from all around the world and found some common elements between them. So it's not, saying you have to use this formula to write a story, but it's looking at some of the common themes. So, and this is, you can see this playing out in ancient myths as well as modern stories. Star Wars, for example, is pretty well known for being based on this story structure. So there's a lot to it. We could spend a lot more time on it, but basically, the main character, the hero, Hallmark Channel movies. Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of Hallmark Channel. I don't think I've seen any, but I'm aware of they have kind of the same structure over and over. And yeah, so basically the hero is in their normal world, and there's some kind of call to adventure or some kind of inciting incident that brings them from the known world into this new unknown world. And they go through some challenges and go through some kind of change, and then come back to the known world with their newfound knowledge or their newfound experience or something, and they're back in the known world, but something's different now. And so this is again not any kind of rule, but this is just something that I've been thinking about. You know, this is, you can get into a lot of detail with this story structure. And there are other story structures that you can look at too, but this is a common one. But I've been thinking about how if you simplified it down to the core, maybe basically what it is that a change happens. Maybe that's the core of what a story is. And maybe that's kind of the core of what science is. You know, we're observing change that's happening in the world around us. You know, a lot of science is observing change over time or things like that. So I wonder if that could be kind of the common ground between story and science. Just, you know, we live in the world and things are changing and we're changing, and how does that affect things? So that's a point that's open for discussion, but it's something that I've been wondering about. And so then if we're clear, you know, if we're a scientist, we can all think like scientists and we can all be scientists. So maybe if we're clear to other people about what change is occurring and why that matters, maybe that could help to convey a sense of exploration and discovery to the reader or to the person we're telling the story to. And that might help make the science more interesting versus just, you know, here's a list of facts. And yeah, so story structures such as this are commonly used for creative writing and for fiction and screenplays and movies. But we might be able to apply some of these ideas to nature writing too, to science writing. And so this is a really cool quote from E.O. Wilson, who is a very famous naturalist, if you haven't heard of him. And he wrote, "Natural history writers are storytellers. Scientists are storytellers. Scientists live and die by their ability to depart from the tribe and go out into an unknown terrain and bring back, like a carcass newly speared, some discovery or new fact or theoretical insight and lay it in front of the tribe. And then they all gather and dance around it. Symposia are held in the National Academy of Sciences and prizes are given. There is fundamentally no difference from a Paleolithic campsite celebration." So, you know, science or an ancient myth, it's kind of the same idea of going out, learning something new and bringing it back to share with everyone. So any thoughts about is there anything anyone wants to discuss or any questions from the last few minutes and everything that we've talked about stories?
Could you give us just a brief example?
A brief example of what? You're muted, Deborah.
The last slide. I think it's the last slide. My cat's hiding my page here. So,
Do you mean the science storytelling?
actually, the one before that, I think it is.
This one?
No, it really was the other one. Just an example of if we're writing it in our journal, how it might be different than yeah, yes.
How it might be different than, if you're
Just
writing
a
a
list,
story.
just a
Well-
list, or just little notes on the page.
Oh, so hang on, there's a couple things in chat I want to address. So
Sure.
let me just focus on yours first. Yeah, so again, this is something that I'm just kind of exploring for myself as well.
Okay.
There's no right or wrong. And
Oh,
you might I think this is something we could all learn from each other too. But so your question is about this writing, the next writing activity. How do we make it more like a story? Well,
yeah.
So I think one of the things, if you're writing a story that's completely fictional, you can, make up whatever you want. You can manipulate all these different elements to get them into some kind of story. But if you're nature writing, you're reporting what's actually there. And so, if we want to stay true to the facts and to our observations, we don't want to manipulate anything or exaggerate it to make it more important than it really is. But I think maybe it's more about writing from a certain perspective to just try to show what's going on in an interesting way. I feel like I'm just kind of repeating myself. I don't know if that helps.
Well, maybe I wasn't clear on my question. Often journals will have, let's say, a bird, and then there'll be little lines to identify the color of the bird and the patterns on the bird, and maybe the flower the bird's sitting on. How would you use prose then? Would you use more sentences then? Or that, I guess my question is more basic than
okay. Yeah, so I think something that I should address here is that something I've said a lot in these workshops, but not today, is there's writing as a tool to learn and a tool to observe. That's more like for yourself, like the process of learning. And most people, when they think of writing to communicate, like writing a paper for school or something like that. And so when we're going to stories, most of what I focused on in these workshops so far is writing as a tool, as a process for learning. And so that's more of the, taking notes or whatever. And everything today is a little bit more of writing to communicate, and that could be telling the story just for yourself or to share with other people. So it's kind of like the second step. Okay. First you would go out and do your nature journaling, do your process of whatever you do, and then you can kind of reformat it or put it more clearly into a story, but you don't have to worry about, oh, I'm going out in nature, I'm going to sit down in nature journal, and it's got to immediately be a well-crafted story right away. Like, we can just nature journal whatever way we normally would, and then it's more of how can we turn that into a story, or how can we communicate that in a way that is more like a story.
Okay, that was very helpful.
So yeah. That's why I had us write a little bit at the beginning today instead of just at the end, because there are different purposes of writing.
Gotcha.
And then in the chat, we have a comment that says, E.O. Wilson's interpretation feels somehow conquest/colonialist oriented. I'd be curious about how other cultures might perceive gaining knowledge. And yeah, that's a really good point. I'm glad that you brought that up, because, like the hero's journey, for example, it's kind of was proposed as like, this is basically every single story, but it's not. And that definitely is one criticism of this model, is that other cultures might have different models of storytelling. And it is very much of like, whether you're to call it like Western colonialist or like very masculine model of storytelling, like the hero or the warrior, the hunter going out and, defeating the enemy and then coming back victorious to the tribe. It's thought of as kind of universal, but it's really not. And there are other models that we can use for storytelling and different cultures, and that's something that I actually want to explore more. I'm thinking about doing other workshops in the future that kind of look at alternate models, but I think and this there definitely is like we've got to be mindful of the colonialism inherent in this kind of interpretation, because of, when you're thinking about like, oh, people in a tribe going out and, then coming back and telling the stories. Like from, if you're in a culture that's coming from a Western mindset, like I think it's important to be mindful of how we're representing tribal cultures, and to not see them as just kind of all the same thing, because they're all very different cultures. But I do think, like, to an extent, if you go far enough back in history, we all come from, groups of people that lived in small groups, and this kind of idea of, I think all of us had ancestors at some point where you'd have to learn about the world, go out and learn things, and then come back and share it with other people. Like, oh, here's what I found today. We found this plant that we're going to eat, or whatever it is. And I think that's might be true that or at least I like the idea that in a fundamental way, it's kind of the same thing we're doing as scientists or as nature journalers. We're going out, observing what's happening around us today and what we can learn. And we might not be living, directly off the land anymore, where it really matters to our survival that we share with other people. Like, oh, here's this patch of berries that I found, or here's this trail that shows where the deer are going. But still we're, as nature journalers, we're, and as naturalists, we're keyed into, or we're paying attention to what's happening in the world around us a lot more closely than, the average person in modern society who's not really paying attention to nature. And so I think that's still important, this idea that, we can be the ones to tell the stories of these places where we live and the creatures. And, we can be, we don't have to go out on a grand adventure. We could go outside right out our front door and see things that are happening. And then, we bring it back to share with each other. Whether that's to tell our family or share it on the Nature Journal Facebook page, or whether it's presented in some kind of more scientific way. So I guess those are my thoughts about it. Thanks, Anna, for bringing up that point, and I'm happy to continue this discussion at any time. And yeah, Braiding Sweetgrass is a really good book to look at different perspectives of nature and science and indigenous knowledge and different cultures and all of those ideas. So with that, yeah, and I did a workshop a few weeks ago about one of the ideas from braiding sweetgrass, but if anyone's interested, we could do more with that. Okay, so let's take, we don't have that much time left. Let's just do 5 minutes again. And, it doesn't have to be a long story, but let's just revisit our story or our notes from earlier. And you don't necessarily have to write the whole story right now, but you might think about, using, or keeping in mind setting, character, conflict, theme, and plot. How could you make your notes from earlier into a story that might be more interesting to share with other people? And I think someone in the chat said, like, you already kind of wrote it as a story. And yeah, I think mine kind of just naturally fell into a story too. Like humans are kind of natural storytellers. But you might want to just, even so, take another look at it and see if you can consciously pick out, who's a character or what's the conflict. And think about if there are any ways that you could enhance it even more. Okay, I'm going to put the timer on for 5 minutes. Okay, that was 5 minutes. If you'd like to write more, you're welcome to after the workshop. But for the last few minutes, I'd like to invite anybody to share either if you want to share your story or if you'd like to share what this process was like for you, if you have any thoughts about it. Alexandra?
I'll be happy to share my story. It was early September of 2019, and I was on the greatest hike of my life, hiking to the Grinnell Glacier in Glacier National Park. Partway up the 2,000-foot elevation climb, I encountered a big horned sheep munching on bushes, maybe 15 feet off the trail. I froze in place, not knowing what to do. Should I stay still in case of startling him or keep moving? I stayed still, staring. I watched him slowly lift his head and our eyes locked. I couldn't look away. I thought, oh gosh, will he interpret my sustained eye contact as some sort of challenge? We stared unbroken for what was probably a shorter time than it felt like. Then he decided the bush was more interesting than me and went back to munching. He was so magnificent, it was difficult to move on, but I didn't want to press my luck. I call it the epic stare down.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you
a
for
great
sharing.
story. Wow.
Was there anything that you added or enhanced after the first writing session that
I
made
think
it a little?
Well, I refined my writing from the original instructions of don't worry about complete sentences and getting some things down. So I did go back in and kind of make them a little bit more complete, and I added some adjectives that like we stared unbroken. That word unbroken really matters to the way that whole event felt, because it was absolutely unbroken. So the extra time I was able to go in and fill in more information like that.
Sehen können, das ist Umberto Bocchione, der Dynamismus eines Fußballspielers heißt dieses Bild. Und da sieht man eben auch schon, dass so eine konzentrierte, ja, schon fast organische Masse aus der Mitte nach außen
Christian?
schwebt. Gehalten.
You're not muted, Christian.
Und Wert zwischen Fläche und Räumlichkeit ist da eben angelegt, und die Futuristen haben unglaublich dynamische Mal.
Okay. It's like, I don't think she's trying to talk to us because most of us don't know German. Does anyone else want to share?
This is Deborah. Is it okay if I share?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Mine is quite different. Boy, I'll tell you what, though, I was just on the edge of my seat wanting to find out what happened with the sheep. So you'll have to write chapter 2. I'm just going to quickly read my list and then read the story. I just had waterfall, remote, high Sierras, crevice between granite crag, giant boulders, water crashing, feeling the power of the water, ferns grow along the sides. And I had other little notes like that. So what I thought in my mind is I need something to connect to this. So I don't know if this is okay to do. I certainly have seen this happen, but it wasn't what I was thinking of. I put a large pine cone floats in the pond and glides, I can't read my own writing here, and glides with the gentle current towards an opening between two giant granite boulders. The pull of the current strengthens the closer to the boulder the pine cone gets. Suddenly, it slips through the boulders and disappears into the spray of the waterfall. A brown object appears as in the torrent of the waters as it crashes on a boulder blanketed in ferns. Its last, and then I have a sentence that wasn't completed. So basically what I was trying to do is to use the pine cone to show how powerful this waterfall was. And so I'm not sure if that's okay or not, because that is putting a little, I mean, I don't want to say fiction, but that is changing it a little bit, and it's not totally scientific from the specific experience I was talking about, although I've seen similar. So,
Well, there are no rules here, so
Yeah.
there's not really any, anything that's allowed or not allowed. I think yours is really interesting because it doesn't have a human character. You're describing this feature of the natural world and the water. And I like how you started with all of your observations. So it didn't just start out as a story. You started with observing and using your 5 senses, and then you're thinking about how could you make that into a story. So you kind of put in the pine cone as a character, and you were using your imagination, but that kind of helps us to really take us through that whole journey. And I think that's really interesting.
and that was kind of my thought. And I was trying to decide, okay, shall I tell what happens to the pine cone at the end? Is it smashed? Does it just bob and float away? Or do I leave it to the imagination? It never came out. We don't know what happened to it. So, or not came out, but we never saw it again, after it went down. So.
Yeah, and that's a personal choice too. Like with any kind of stories, it could be a clear ending, a happy ending, or a sad ending, or it could be open-ended and left to your imagination or left to interpretation. So it is 1 o'clock now. Thank you everyone for coming. If anyone would like to stay a little bit longer and share, you're welcome to, though.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, everyone. Rayvanto?
Yeah, I'd like to share. Well,
Sure.
So about a heron I saw, and it was fishing. A heron sits on a stone wall, sitting in a river. Calm and slow, it suddenly seems to sense something and bends its neck. And suddenly, without warning, it dives into the water head first and struggles in the water and pulls its head out and comes back with a fish. It puts it in its mouth and swallows it and flew away.
Thank you for sharing that. So it's a heron, I think is what you said. And yes. It's about how the heron is catching a fish.
Yes.
Yeah, so I really liked how that you focused on a specific behavior of an animal and in their environment. And I think these kind of stories can be really powerful because they're all living their lives too. And I think, when we were talking earlier about, stories could be something that we relate to, or it could be something more in our imagination. And I think animal stories are a little bit of both because we all have to live, we all have to eat, we all go through obstacles, but at the same time, to imagine the life of a creature that's so different from human, it's like brings us into this other world. And so I wonder if that's why animal stories can be really powerful. And so your little story there brought us into the world of this heron, and makes us think about what their life might be like.
I'd be open to sharing.
Sure.
Okay. The large black raven landed on the Joshua tree a few feet from where we'd stopped to eat lunch. It was hot, but definitely under 80 degrees. We both had dampened bandanas around our necks to cool off, and had a yummy spread of hummus and carrots and cucumbers and chips and salsa and 2 glasses of red wine, chocolate covered madeleines and coconut water. I coconutted at the raven, and it was almost like he cocked his head to observe the weird looking big bird with a wide brimmed hat. He hopped to the ground and started gathering pebbles in his beak. At first, I thought he was hunting for food. He hopped under a nearby branch and sharpened his beak like a knife on a sharpening stick, back and forth against the Joshua tree bark, side to side, alternating. He stayed perhaps for 5 minutes. I tried cawing at him, not caring how silly it looked to the family of 4 with 2 small children who'd hiked up, as I crowed away. And then, with a hop into the air and an expansive spread of his glossy black wings, he took to flight. What I wanted was an interaction with the raven. The conflict was to throw or not throw food. Clearly, the raven was used to messy humans, intentionally or unintentionally leaving scraps. The desire was for a closer interaction with nature, a bird to land on my arm and sing with me like in Mary Poppins, or a clear omen, the raven as bringer of magic in the tarot, a card I'd pulled the following day. I wanted some symbolic, neat representation of the change I'm aiming to create in my life, some interspecies communication, something somehow meaningful. As it was, the raven stopped, ate some pebbles, looked at me when I imitated its coconutting sound, sharpened its beak, and probably figured out we weren't going to be the giving food type of humans, and got on its way. Animals in national parks aren't very wild. Like the ground squirrel we threw rocks at. It wouldn't run away. The rocks could have been food. We had to chase it instead. There have to be signs saying a fed coyote is a dead coyote. They could become aggressive or expect to eat human food. The parks have to train us.
Thank you for sharing that. And I really like for yours, you were the character in your story. And then I like the part where you stepped back and thought about what was your conflict, what was it you wanted in that situation. And that's making me think about, all these questions that we're kind of grappling with here in this workshop. Was like, we want to have a certain experience in nature. We want to have meaning into our lives from our experience with nature. But animals are living their own lives. We don't always understand them. They're not always, the way that we would want them to be. And that itself is a conflict. Do you feed the animal or do you not? Then even if you know that you shouldn't, I think for a lot of us, there's a part of us that still wants to. We still want that, Disney princess moment. All the birds are landing on my arms and it's so magical. Like, even if we know that's not real, like we still kind of want that. And that in itself is a conflict that could be a story. And, this idea of how much of our writing is imaginative or creative and how much of it is scientific, how much are we interpreting it, what's okay, what's so not okay, like that itself is a conflict. I think that's the story that we're all living here, in this workshop, and that's our story as nature journalers and explorers.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for offering this.
Thanks for sharing. Would anyone else like to share? Jane?
Mine's not quite as long as those ones, but I started
That's
out
okay. Mine's pretty short also.
as I walk through the silence of the Badlands, I see the world as it has been seen by those creatures that came before me. The only sound is the wind blowing through the grass, the buzz of insects, or the call of birds flying across the sky, or the occasional sound of deer, rabbits, mice, or other mammals scurrying to find shelter. The view as I reached the plateau of this particular Badland was similar but unique as the previous ones I had climbed. I could see the reds, pinks, yellows, and oranges of the Badlands, the colors of the grass and wildflowers, and the river twisting around the bends below me.
Thank you for sharing, Jane. I have never been to the Badlands, and it's very different from the place where I live. So I like how your story was able to show that to all of us.
I worked for the National Park Service, and I had the North Dakota and South Dakota Badlands are both in my region. So
Oh, cool.
I've done vegetative monitoring, water quality monitoring, bird monitoring, small mammal studies and different things in all those parks. So I'd been walked through many, many miles of those parks backcountry.
And yeah, great imagery, as Anna said in the chat. Jane, were there any specific elements of story that you thought about in relation to your piece?
Well, the character, I mean, it's like I'm the character, but I'm also have all the different wildlife and animals and organisms, the grasses, the trees, the whatever. So I don't even know exactly who the character of my story is. The setting, so I got the setting part of it. Maybe I'm the character and the setting is all of the wildlife and organisms that live there. My story was going to kind of progress that when I was hiking, it's such a desolate area. You don't see people, cars, civilization at all when you're out there. So it makes me feel like I was one of the first ones to ever walk on that ground, but I'm sure I wasn't. But the Native Americans were there long before I was. But that's just something that I think of when I'm out there. It's like, this is what it looked like way back when, too. It's a wild area and it's something that needs to be preserved, I guess.
Thank you, Jean. Would anyone else who's still here like to share? I could share mine too. So I didn't get very far, but I was nature journaling yesterday. There were some toads in my backyard singing. Because we have a pool, but it hasn't been cleaned out for the summer yet, so it's still like all like leaves and stuff. And I realized they were singing in the pond, so I just started writing it as a little more of a narrative. Yesterday I went for a walk before bed, and I just got back to my room, took off my shoes, etc. I wasn't planning to go out again, but then I heard it. American toads singing / screaming outside my window. I wondered, are they coming from the pool? I had to find out. So I put my shoes back on and my rain jacket and went into the falling darkness. I got a flashlight. I got louder as I approached. Yep, that's where they are. And I was going to go on, but then I started thinking about, who's the character? That's me, but I could change it to write from the perspective of the toads. or maybe from the thunder, because I was going to say it started storming soon after that. I know in some Native American cultures, they say April or May is the time when the thunderers are returning. They're kind of like the grandfathers, so that could conceivably be a character. The conflict that kind of came up here is the discovery itself. Was I going to go with my original plan and just start getting ready for bed, or go back out again? And this kind of struggle of, it might not be an adventure to the North Pole or something like that, but it's, the going out of the comfort zone and exploring for the sake of wanting to learn something. It's kind of turned into that traditional explorer narrative. The plot is, that process of discovery setting is my backyard. And I also, it also made me realize that time is an important part of the setting, because it's this place, not just any time, but the springtime and at night and at this period in history. Those are all important aspects of where and when our story takes place.
Did you ever find the frogs?
I did, yeah. I guess I didn't mention that, but that was what I was going to get to next. I had a flashlight, I shined it, and I saw, you could see their eyes glowing, and I could write more about that, but instead of just hearing it out the window, then they're there right in front of me, and I could see the throat pouches going, like all filling up, and I was actually able to get really close to them before they started hopping away. So that was an exciting little adventure that I had last night. Okay, last call for any other stories to share, or any thoughts about stories and nature, or any comments or questions about what we've talked about today. And hi, Deborah's cat.
Oh, yes.
All right, so I'm thinking next time a workshop I've been wanting to do is like how to give and receive feedback on our writing. So that might be one that I do next time. We could all bring our stories again, or another story, and then we have something to share with each other and think about, what is, how we give feedback. It depends on our purpose for writing and what we're trying to get out of it. So, it could be encouragement or trying to hone a specific writing related skill. So I think that is probably what we'll do next time, so that we can all help each other grow. Because when we share, usually I give some comments, but we can kind of all start to give more comments that are both encouraging and helpful to each other. So thank you all so much for coming, and I hope to see you again next time.
Bye, Rebecca.
Bye, Ribanto.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
Deborah. Bye, everyone.